I'm gonna have to pause that. Brilliant. Thank you all for joining us. I feel like more people will pop on as we move our way through the hour. My name is Jessica Dauphin. I'm the president and CEO of Transit Alliance of Middle Tennessee. Welcome to our Lunchtime Speaker Series. This is our fourth and last for 2021. And I am joined today by a very special guest whom I have the pleasure to know. Her name is Ashley Northington. She is from Nashville. She is a small business owner. She has a depth of knowledge that I assure you is magnificent and will wow you today. And before we get there, before we get to her, I want to just set up our conversation. Why are we talking to Ashley today? Our speaker series this year has focused on several different aspects of transportation and transit, beginning with a 5-person Austin panel talking to us about their successful $7.1 billion with a B, $7.1 billion transit funding referendum that passed in November of 2020. Yes, during the height of safer at home measures and COVID-19, they passed $7 billion for transit. We picked their brain to figure out what brilliance was behind that campaign. Then we spoke to Beth Osborne, the Director of Transportation for America, and she enlightened us about the federal aspects of transit and transportation funding, what their current campaigns are in terms of changing up the narrative and federal funding for transit to date, meaning for the last, 4 to 6 decades, it's been about the same. And so you're looking at an 80-20 split, with 80% of our federal funding going to highways and roads and only 20% going to competitive grants for our transit. And what it would be like to change that up even just a little. So they're working on that in Congress as we speak. And then last month, we spoke with Jason Spain, who walked us through transit in Tennessee, because my work has me cross paths with folks every day who tell me that people in Tennessee just don't take transit. We're just not those type people. And I wanted to get to the bottom of that. Is that true? I mean, are we just transit resistant, right? Teflon or whatever. Turns out not so much. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen that yet, you can if you go to our website, or I can just tell you, Tennesseans take transit every day. Even during COVID, we had nearly 14 million people ride transit in the state of Tennessee. So it is not transit in and of itself that residents of Middle Tennessee are resistant to. I think, and I believe personally, it's just inadequate service that's not efficient, effective, or convenient enough for people to be able to utilize. And that brings us to today. Ashley Northington is here. She's got some fantastic personal history with this, and she can tell us why we would need to invest in transit. Why would we put money toward it? Why would a city, a state, or the country want to support public transit? So first, Ashley, I want you to introduce yourself to the good people on the webinar.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jessica, for laying the groundwork about why we're here today. I am so excited to talk to you folks about, my perspective about why I think transit is super essential and sort of the bedrock for opportunity for folks in the Nashville region. I am a native Nashvilleian, small business owner, and public relations executive. I am the vice chair of Moving Forward and have been so since 2020, I think, right at the start of COVID, which was an exciting time. Um, and I'm just happy to be here. Would you like me to share a little bit more about myself, or you want to?
Let's get in. I want to you mentioned it just briefly. You said transportation is the bedrock of opportunity. I want you to unpack that and why you think that.
So, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to start with a little bit of personal history so that you all can understand why I feel that way and how I've arrived at this conclusion. So I am a fourth generation Nashville native. So I've been here. My family's been here for a long time. And when I was growing up, there was a point in my life where my family only had one car, and that one car was responsible for transporting my grandmother, my father, my mother, and my three siblings, me and my two siblings, three of us together, everywhere we needed to go. And sometimes that was very difficult. We lived off of Gallatin Road at that time, and we could have taken public transit because it was available. The bus was available. They called it MTA back then, before we got our fancy WeGo name. Um, but people didn't. We did not take transit because the thought was that it was for poor people. It was unclean. It was not safe, and we had a car, so there was no need for us to take transit. But that eventually led to my grandmother having to stop working so that she could take care of us, and so they wouldn't be so stressful for her to get back and forth to work. That made it very difficult for us to get to school. We had to go to certain schools so that my great grandmother could be there to watch us, after we got home from school. The inability to move around the city and avoiding transit was really, really stressful for my family at that point in my early childhood. Now, fast forward to today, I see my younger brother. And he's been in Nashville a long time. My younger brother, unfortunately, through a series of bad decisions or unfortunate decisions, he is left without a high school diploma. Because my brother doesn't have a high school diploma, he can't really get access to a great job. He knows this. So because he can't get access to a great job, guess what he doesn't have? A car. So he knows that the way for him to get set up for success in life is to complete his GED. But because he doesn't have a car and transit is unreliable, it is very hard for him to get to his classes that he has to take to complete the GED process. That has been very strenuous for him. Even when people in our family volunteer to take him back and forth, there's a lot of maneuvering that has to go into making that happen. And so because my brother doesn't have a high school diploma, he doesn't have a great job, it means he can't get a car, his access to opportunity is severely limited, all because he doesn't live near a bus stop where that can take him to and from where he needs to be. And even if he did, it might take him several hours to get back and forth. And that's really challenging for him because he's the primary caretaker for his son, my precious, precious nephew who has my same face. So, transit is the bedrock of opportunity. It is the way in which people get access to education. It is the way in which people get access to jobs. And usually when we have the conversation around transit, we usually frame it as like, is this gonna be, does Nashville have the culture for people to ride the bus? Do people in the South wanna take the bus? Or the conversation is around like, oh my gosh, is this gonna make my commute easier? And while I think those things are important, like, do people, give up their cars or not? Is it going to take me 30 minutes or an hour to get to work? I think that's important. But I know that when we start there, if that's our starting point, we've lost the game. because it's not about whether or not you're going to give up your car or whether or not you think it's in fashion to ride the bus or get on a train. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you can afford to live in this city. The issue is whether or not you have the access to the opportunity to do whatever it is you want. Do you have access to get a better job? Do you have access to complete school or not? And we know that transportation costs equal about 21% of folks' incomes right now. They're spending about 21% of their incomes on transportation. We know that people are spending about 30% or so of their income on housing. So we take, 50% of the money that you make is spent on housing and transportation, and that number is rapidly increasing. People barely have enough to live. We're not talking about paying taxes. We're not talking about paying student loans. We haven't talked about clothing. We haven't talked about, food, the thing you actually need to sustain. So people don't have the ability to provide for themselves in a city that's growing as rapidly as Nashville is. And transit is a key that could help unlock some of our low and moderate income families, unlock the key to prosperity for them. And I'll stop talking right
You don't have to cut yourself short. That's fine.
there.
It's brilliant. And you've got some folks chatting, throwing in some chats about this is an important concept to explore. Thank you for that validation, vote of confidence for Transit Alliance exploring this aspect, because as Ashley mentioned, oftentimes we look at it as project by project. How big is the project? What's it going to do for me? Anything else besides how is this adding value to those who live here? And Ashley, you mentioned education twice in that answer. Some other things you mentioned was it was a barrier to your grandmother being able to keep a job. Mm-hmm. And that is also a barrier to building wealth and
Absolutely.
generational wealth.
Right. So, I work in education. I work in transit too. I work in marketing and public relations. I do all these things, but really I'm in the prosperity business, right? Because I am always trying to figure out what are the ways and pathways for more people to gain opportunities, right? So I know that the way that I was able to change my circumstance was through education. So I work very deeply in education. I know from my personal experiences as a child, from seeing my brother struggle, from having potential employees ask me to buy them cars for them, from having to cart interns all over the city, that transit is important and a way for folks to gain a prosperity, right? And so I think policy, of course, underscores everything. That is how you get to make everything happen, right? And so when I think about the web or the network that we have to think about when we consider transit, it can't be just in a silo where we're talking about traffic lights or sidewalks or traffic, or whether or not we have a bus shelter. Those things are supremely important. It has to be a step back and look at how does transit connect the city? How does it connect us to other opportunities? Jessica, you say transit is the way that, it's tied to, our individual freedoms are tied to mobility. That's the right quote. And I think when we look at transit and we look at that a system, we have to think about how does this improve our health? How does this improve our finances? How does this affect our housing ability? Amazon has just gotten behind it made a significant investment in Nashville to build 800 affordable housing units along high capacity transit corridors. Like, we have to look at the totality of this. And I think that when we are limiting ourselves and we are missing out on the opportunity to really connect to what people care about when we just talk about transit in terms of whether or not people are going to ride the bus or not. You know what I mean? We have to be thinking about, how does this affect our education system? How does this really affect the way we are able to afford food? Like, we have to really get into the things that people care about. People aren't necessarily that good at thinking about, their future selves. So if I make this investment today, in 5 years, I'm able to have this. People aren't good at thinking about their future selves. If they were, more people perhaps be prepared for retirement. Perhaps I wouldn't have ate a fried pork chop last night or this morning if I thought more about my future self. I think that when we talk about transit, we have to think about it. How does this benefit our future selves? Right? And we have to do it in a way that really sort of doubles down on what people care about. And people absolutely care about, how does transit affect my ability to be prosperous in this city? And when we start peeling back the layers of how expensive it is to own a car, how expensive housing is getting, how it cost burden families already are, I think then we begin to really hit on the issues that people care about. And we sort of change the conversation from just talking about streetlights to something more broadly about, like, how do we make Nashville work for everyone?
Yes, thank you for that. I preach that message because you just tied it all together magnificently, and I told you that she would. um, I want to revisit some things that you just went through, and you're touching all the bases here. Worrying about transportation has been stressful, right? I could, this ain't about me, but I can attest to that from you have a tire blowout and you ain't got the money to replace that tire and you're on your way to work. What do you do? I've been there, right? Um, so you're in the prosperity business, and then you mentioned you've had to drive interns
Mm-hmm.
around, and the ask for you to purchase a car for a potential employee. And this is kind of a side note, but just to illustrate the gravitas of the need for transportation. Can you please tell us about one or both of those?
Yeah. So every time I've ever had an intern that didn't have a car, they needed me to pick them up and take them to where they needed to be, especially in Nashville. So I'm responsible now for either sending an Uber or going to get them myself, because I have always been, again, I'm in the prosperity business, and most of the folks that have interned for me in Nashville have been graduates of my alma mater, Tennessee State University. And so I'm going to make sure that they have the opportunity. And so I've had to take students to and from their dorm rooms to make sure that they could work their shifts, and to make sure that they were able to capitalize on the opportunity, and that transportation wasn't a barrier for them, because the hours that you have to work with me aren't necessarily going to be the same hours that the bus is going to run. So that's one. And then two, the lady who I was interviewing, she had just moved back here. She's originally from here, had moved back here from Washington, D.C., where she had worked for several years. Alexa's telling me that lunchtime is over. And in that time in Washington, D.C., she did not need a vehicle. And it didn't really occur to her that she would need one. She had come back to Nashville to take care of her mother. And so she didn't necessarily have the finances at the ready to buy a car. And she didn't realize how living in Antioch and having to come to work in East Nashville on Main Street would be such a burden for her in terms of getting there. And so, bless her heart, she asked me, she was like, listen, I found a car. It's $1,500. Can you buy this vehicle for me? And I promise you, I will work for free until I work off the amount of money it is to pay for this vehicle. That is what we're talking about, people, because she knew that if she didn't get a vehicle, she wouldn't be able to take care of her mom. She wouldn't be able to work a job. She wouldn't be able to get groceries. She wouldn't be able to do the basic things that many of us take for granted. So again, it's not about whether or not you are going to drive 30 minutes or an hour to work. This is quite literally about whether or not you can afford to live in this city. Transit is the key that unlocks opportunity for so many of us. And I just wish that we would talk about that more.
And I mean, those stories are unbelievable to me because you are the nicest boss to drive interns around and to even entertain purchasing a vehicle for someone. Imagine, okay, if that was your experience, imagine the number of folks living in Nashville whom that was not even a possibility to ask their boss.
Yeah.
This is a rhetorical question. We don't have to get into it. I just want everyone to just think about that for a second. This is one person in her personal stories. Imagine the numbers of folks who didn't have the opportunity to even ask a boss, right? Because they didn't have transportation. They didn't have that opportunity. I'm gonna bring it back around.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
let's talk for a second about why it may not be so convenient and adequate in Nashville, right? Like, so why is that? And you mentioned some things up front, like there is this stigma that only poor people take the bus. It may not be too safe, whatever. But actually, today in 2021, we don't have we have MTA, but there we go. They're flashy purple, shiny buses, right? They're pretty. They've got Wi-Fi charges on them, like Wi-Fi and phone charges on them. Why do you think it's still not a viable option to take transit for so many?
Because we haven't learned to communicate with people at their point of need. We haven't learned to do that effectively. And so we've had several opportunities to increase, funding and investment for transit, and those opportunities have been unsuccessful. So I think about it two ways. First, we haven't made the investment. Second, there's this idea that people won't take transit if more is offered, because we're Southern, and that's not what you do in a Southern city. This isn't Chicago, or this isn't Atlanta, or wherever. This is Nashville, and Nashville, all of that. I didn't know in 2008 that I was going to become a slave to this phone until Steve Jobs and company gave it to me, right? Like when I saw it, I was like, I have to have this, right? This is the easiest, best thing in the world. And now I have like two of them that I cart around with me every day. I think if we had the opportunity or the option to take it, people would. But we don't have that option. And we don't have that option because we haven't made the investment. And we've been unable to make the investment because we haven't learned to communicate with people at the point of need that gets them into action to care, or gets them into action to vote yes. And I'm just going to say it. So the people in Austin did a very simple, very miraculous thing. I keep talking about it because it is the absolute most critical thing. They asked people what they wanted, and then they gave it to them. And when they said, well, we want something else, they changed the plan to address what the citizens asked for. Where we have failed in Nashville is that we have not been responsive enough to community concerns. I am super fearful that we are on the brink of doing that again. Here's what happens, and I'm gonna bring up one example that is current. There is this proposed cap on I-40 that is supposed to reconnect North Nashville. Many of us know the history around the interstate destroying that community, significantly, displacing people. We know that story. This interstate cap is meant to reconnect folks. Well, what has happened is that we have to ask for the money from the federal government to do this project. And so we've asked for this money to complete this project. Turns out many people in the community don't quite know about that yet. So after we may get the money or we don't, if we do, we have to then go to the community and ask them what they want. But we already have a plan and we've already said how we're going to spend it. So people in the community sort of feel like, well, what are you coming to me now about? Because you already have a plan and now I'm an afterthought and you're going to come to me after the fact to ask for how we should do this money. I don't want to participate, or I feel like this is not authentic or transparent because you've already asked a plan. We have not learned how to be responsive. We have not learned how to be transparent and open enough on the outset to get the necessary investment and buy-in on the front end so that we can make the investment in transit so that people can have the options, that they would, so they can choose it.
Right. I've noted some similar discrepancies between the way Nashville goes about these kinds of things and the winning proposition in Austin specifically. That was a great rundown of one project, the proposed cap, Jefferson Street cap over I-40. And we do have, for those of you who may not know, I can share a link. There's a link that details what happened about 40 years ago or so when I-40 was built, and the backlash from the neighborhood that tried to stand up against the building of that project, and they were unsuccessful, and that sort of thing. So you can kind of get an idea of the history and why reconnecting Jefferson Street community would be even a thought for the city. But to Ashley's point, getting buy-in from community and residents first is paramount.
Right.
Matter of fact, after the last referendum in 2018 that failed, the Let's Move Nashville, the biggest outcry we heard was, I am not reflected in this plan.
Mm-hmm. I don't like the plan. Right.
I don't like the plan. I don't really know anything about the plan. That happened before I got into my position. And so I was kind of watching it play out. And then we had the big articles came out afterward. This is what Nashville did wrong, apparently, and reading through some of those. And mostly it really comes down to, like Ashley's saying, it's the communication and the transparency, and then utilizing community feedback in a plan. If you're going to use tax dollars, it's probably a good idea to take that feedback and use it the way they were asking you to, right?
Mm-hmm. I just want to say, just to back up a little bit, in 2017, I was appointed to serve on Mayor Berry's task force for transit and affordability. And I was the small business lead, and I was chosen to do that because my business is located on a high capacity transit corridor. What that task force was charged with doing was to create a system of policies to help mitigate displacement along the transit corridors, because we knew that if that plan passed, if people voted in that referendum, that there would be people who would be displaced, or there would be businesses that would be displaced. And so what we were trying to do was to come up with some sort of stopgap measures to make sure that people could still afford to live in and work in those communities, and that the character would remain unchanged. In that referendum process, there were a couple of things that happened. First, there was this process that happened, this strategic planning process that happened 5 years, leading up to it. And that's how the sort of plan was developed. The vote was not around the plan. The vote was around the money. But the community said, wait just a second. You want me to vote to pay my money into this plan that I don't approve of, that I'm not reflected in, that doesn't work for me, that doesn't go far enough for me. And so then this task force was sort of built to sort of address those concerns of gentrification. And so we came up with a lot of great stuff, but it appeared to some to be an afterthought. And so what we have to do is to make sure that we get buy-in from the entire community on the front end, not going to one or two people and like kiss the ring and act like they speak for an entire community, but really getting into the trenches and talking to as many folks as possible and exposing them to the information and actually hearing their feedback on it in a way that's gonna help, and then being responsive to the feedback. And I just don't think that we've been able to do that well enough, early enough to get the result that we desire.
I hope that with all of the changes coming our way in Nashville with the new Nashville Department of Transportation, namely I'm hoping that will change, because we will be streamlining projects and processes instead of volleyballing them between departments, from planning to works to this to that, and all the different departments. It'll be one department. The National Department of Transportation will be responsible for the planning and process of getting money and grants and building the whole thing from soup to nuts. So maybe times they are changing, right? I mean, we hear, Tiger don't change their stripes, but maybe in some ways this community work that Ashley, that you've been involved in, and so many others have been working toward, it is making a difference, right?
Yeah.
And things tend to happen a lot more slowly than we want them to.
Absolutely.
And maybe this is just part of it. We have to get to your point. We have to get, I don't know, angry enough or feel the pain enough, that pinch, to where we are motivated to speak out and to say something.
Yeah, my grandmother used to always say, a bought lesson is a taught lesson. And what she meant is, if you spend enough money doing something wrong, eventually you learn the lesson and you get it right. So I am hopeful that we have bought enough lessons and that we have learned, and that the investment in the Department of Transportation will certainly help propel us forward into the future. I'm hopeful. It's going to take time for all this stuff to, I'm a now person. I live in now. People that work with me, Ashley, I actually need it now. I'm very impatient, the most impatient person I know. So I hope that we learn from it, and I hope that people are educated enough and informed enough to be able to speak out. That's why the Transit Citizen Leadership Academy is so important. I am a graduate of the award-winning Transit Citizen Leadership Academy. And if we get enough people in that program, which starts in September, then I think we'll get enough advocates to build that groundswell of support, where we have enough people saying, listen, transit is important. And it's not just about whether or not I'm going to drive my car. It's important to the future of this region, and it's important to my neighbors. And I'm happy to be here to participate, and say that this is what we need.
Gracious. Thank you so much for saying that. Transit is like, some of us use it, but all of us need it. And I think our conversation is really illustrating that right now. Thank you for mentioning the TCLA. It's every single class, cohort, whatever we call it, there are aha moments for every single person in that particular cohort. It happens at some point along the way. They learn something that changes their perspective on transit. Now, they may already support transit, which is fine, but during that process of that class, they learn something that either reinforces, validates, or strengthens their motivation to advocate for transit. And it's really incredible. For those who are transit agnostic, so to speak, who come to TCLA and they're like, I don't know about transit. You know, my friend spoke highly, my boss wanted me to take it, whatever. They come and they have an aha moment where they're like, holy cow, I had this whole thing built in my head. I was writing this narrative, but all of what I've learned here has changed that. And now I truly do support funding transit. It is, you know, not to hammer it or put too fine a point, but it is kind of life-changing in a lot of ways, because if it can change your perspective, it can change your actions, your attitude. So it's well worth the time to put in there. And you know, just what was it, Tuesday? Our Metro Council in Nashville, and I know that Transit Alliance is a regional organization, and we work to build support for funding regional transit. That is our long-term goal. Okay. But many of the regional mayors are focused on life in their counties for now, while they're kind of waiting on Nashville to make a big move, because Nashville is the heart of the region. Our region is the heart of the state, both geographically and economically. Nashville has to make that big move first, because Nashville is the center of that hub and spoke thing, right? You have 65% of working adults leaving Robertson County every day, most of them going to Nashville for work. You've got in Rutherford County the entire equal to the entire number of women, men, and children in Smyrna leaving that county every day to go to work. So we need a regional solution. That is not up for debate. But what we're talking about is on Tuesday, Nashville voted to restore funding to WeGo public transit to a baseline budget. Okay. And I've heard from some folks that it was in large part due to advocate emails, that it was even in there. So we put the website tool up, email the mayor, tell them that you support funding transit. Moving forward, wrote emails to the mayor. And some other folks wrote, I see Adams here, Transit Now wrote emails, Connect Mid-10 wrote emails, Walk Bike Nashville wrote emails. The advocacy community really showed up for transit this time. And then we got WeGo's restored baseline funding, which is a win. But Ashley, can you tell me why we would still be a little hesitant to start the parade?
Yeah. Yeah, we shouldn't start the parade just yet. Because, even though we have gotten to the baseline funding, which is great, right? Because WeGo has endured plenty of cuts over the last few years, we still need more, and there won't be this infusion of monies that WeGo and other agencies have from the federal government for COVID relief. That is not going to be there forever. And we cannot rely on that money to support our long-term needs. And so there is, $3.2 million that we asked for, advocates asked for to implement the first part of the Better Bus plan, which would upgrade and renovate some of the technologies and access for the WeGo bus system, but we didn't get that. So, it's up for all of us to keep, pounding the pavement, keep showing up at meetings, keep emailing and talking about how transit really is the pathway for Nashville to work for everyone. And it is the way that we can get some true regionalism moving forward to connect folks to traverse across the city. So
thank you for that. And you often say pathways to prosperity.
Yes, pathway to prosperity.
Yeah.
And I just, I just want to be clear, like we are thankful
Mhm.
that the funding has been restored, but we know that um, to keep pace with this growing city, it's not going to be enough to keep it at that level. And we have got, now is the time to make bold change and to make these investments that we know are going to lead to meaningful outcomes for the folks that live here.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Yeah, we are incredibly grateful, but there is still work to do. There is no wiggle room for improvements. It's just preventing more further service cuts,
Mhm.
um, which is good, and we're grateful for that. But moving forward, we will need more and more, which is why arguing our case for the dedicated funding source is so critical.
Yes.
Because every year we're gonna teeter on the edge. Like, are we gonna get funded? Or are we not gonna get funded? Are we gonna look at stabilizing service, or are we gonna have to cut service somewhere? And if we continue to cut service, it's not gonna bode well for existing residents, for those who are moving in here, for all of the jobs that are coming. We have 11,000 jobs coming down the pike.
Yeah, we're in this really precarious situation with the way Nashville's budgeting process works, where we are always forced to look at sort of this revenues versus expenses. And when we frame the conversation that way, what ends up happening is that there are competing priorities, and it's like whoever is the loudest,
Mhm.
is who gets to win out. But the reality is that all of these things are priorities. And what we want to do as advocates who are championing dedicated funding is to make sure that transit is a priority every year. That's why the dedicated funding piece is so critical to the conversation, because
Mhm.
every year we don't want to be, talking about, well, they spent, X% on this thing, and that's not what we want to eliminate that conversation and really say, here's what we think is valuable in Nashville. And we know that transit is going to lead to meaningful outcomes. So we want to have a dedicated funding source to do that. I think we could do something similar for schools and other um, agencies that we know are so super important, so that we don't have this battle of wills or battle of advocates on the council floor, wrapped around the building, waiting to speak for 2 minutes about something that we all know is important anyway.
Right. Speaking about that, I do love the People's Budget Coalition and the work that they're doing. You know, it's just incredible, and there's a lot of really amazing organizations out there in Nashville right now doing, the Lord's work, as they say. um, but I want to talk a little bit about that affordability piece. And as I'm opening it up, I put in the chat, like, if you all have any questions or comments, please feel free to chime in. Ashley, we only have her for about 15 more minutes. So if you've got something to add or ask, something you want, a perspective you wanted to dig a little deeper into, please do that. In the meantime, Ashley, I want to talk about this Amazon, and you mentioned it already. Amazon has proposed to give $75 million out of their Amazon Housing Fund to Nashville developers to develop affordable housing along high capacity transit corridors here in Nashville.
Mhm. It is so amazing that they've done that. So, I talked about my work in late 2017, early 2018 on the task force for transit and affordability. And through that work, we learned that affordable housing and transit are integrated, right? And so, if we want to make Nashville affordable, we have to look at access to high capacity, reliable transit. And the best way to do that is to build transit oriented developments around these high capacity transit corridors. And so with that being said, Amazon has recognized that transit and affordability are inextricably linked, and they're going to work with developers and other partners to build 800 houses, 800 affordable homes in these high capacity transit corridors. In North Nashville, that's particularly important because the focus there is to mitigate displacement, any displacement that may happen with this proposed I-40 cap. And so in order to make sure that the character of the neighborhoods remains the same and that the people who love and nurture a place can still afford to stay there, they have stepped in and committed this funding. And I think it's incredible and it's exciting to see what could happen. I wish that more corporations would be willing to do that. I'm glad that Amazon has stepped up and said, we've got the cash and we're ready to do this and provide this opportunity to develop at low market rates for those who have low or moderate incomes.
Yes, and there was a question in in the chats about that, and I posted a link to Amazon's press release. You can see there that it is a loan to developers to develop and basically purchase land, either held by WECO or the city at reduced rate, or some acquire land some other way along those high capacity corridors, so they can build their houses a little more cheaply, so they can offer them at cheaper prices,
Yep,
right?
that's correct.
So sorry about that. Let's see. Any thoughts on how our government agencies can work more with private sector to encourage more local investment as they locate here?
Yeah, I think that some of that is happening already. I'm not I think some of that is happening. I think what the community can do in this instance is to put together an action of what we want, or a list of demands, and say, for those businesses that are going to move here who may get incentives or not, this is what we want to see happening in terms of community benefits for the place that we live in. I like community benefits agreements because I think they have an opportunity to be a win-win for everyone involved. You know, the corporations get what it needs to relocate jobs here, and then the community gets a set of benefits to go along with that. And I think affordable housing or investment in transit could be one of those benefits that I think could be super helpful.
I agree. The first thing that came to my mind for the Amazon investment is both that is amazing, and that's exactly what we want to see from our corporate headquarters, or our corporate companies here, right? But I also was like, knowing what we just talked about, Ashley, that our transit funding teeters on the edge of, of inadequate funding every single year. Let's, and also kind of selfishly for Transit Alliance, let's fund the work being done to build support for finding a way to make our transit more adequate, right? And find that dedicated funding source and make that happen, so that those new developments along those high capacity corridors really will make a difference, right, long term. So we know that that transit isn't going to be cut or changed in any way.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is valid to say. You should always plug that, Jessica. Uh, Someone asked, how do we get the benefit of affordable housing near transit if the transit system is not improved at the same time? I think it'd be quite difficult to do so. That's why the advocacy that we do now is so important. That's why it's so critical that we are able to pull our friends on the council to the side and talk to them about it. That's why it's so important that we are in Faye DeMassimo's ears about what needs to happen, and we talk to Mayor Cooper and make sure that our voices are heard, because it's going to be incredibly difficult if transit is not improved, and it's just not feasible at the rate of growth of this city to expect that the people who live here are going to be able to stay and afford it if we don't do something with affordable housing and with transit. It's just
That's
not.
right. And you can come to MTA, which is WeGo. MTA board meetings are the fourth Thursday of every month. You can find that meeting information on the MTA, nationalmta.org website. And just because there's public comment period in any city departmental meeting, there's always going to be a public comment period. You can get up and you can just say simply, I support funding transit. I'd like to see more dedicated funding for transit. But Ashley's right. The advocacy community needs to continue to be aware and awake, and talking to elected officials and those in power about how important funding transit is.
And I think go to WeGo's meeting, go to the MTA board meetings and do that. Bring a friend with you. but also you need to show up at city council. So I think the other thing that typically tends to happen is that we sort of wait until the issue comes up to talk about it. We can never let the issue drop. And we have to say it every month, every meeting. We have to always be out front. Of course, folks like Walk Bike Nashville, Transit Alliance, Connect Mid 10, those advocacy organizations, those coalition partners, they always have it on the forefront. So they're there. But we need regular folks like you and I to show up too and say that this is a priority. I just think we can't let it out of the spotlight. We have to take every opportunity. We have to go to the council meeting and talk about it too. That's where the decisions about the money are being made.
So true. And Brenda, it looks like I don't know if Brenda's on the call. I don't see her name there, but Walk Bike Nashville is doing some outreach on Murfreesboro Pike, talk about sidewalks and bike lanes and transit. If you want to join, you can email Brenda at walkbikenashville.org and you can show up through some public dates they've got here in the chat if you're interested in that. Ashley, we're wrapping it up. You got about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I want you to have the opportunity to say anything you feel is left unsaid at this moment, and then I will ask you one more thing before we go.
Gosh, okay. Anything that I think is left unsaid. I think I've said a lot. So I just would encourage everyone to take the opportunities. And there's a meeting tonight, actually, at 6 p.m. that Sharon Hurt and others are having to talk and learn more about the Jefferson Street cap. I plan to be there.
Excellent. That's excellent.
What's going on. And hear the concerns or, whatever the community wants to talk about. I plan to be there as a listener. So I encourage people to get involved, get engaged, stay engaged, and talk about it to anybody who will listen. I'd also encourage you to encourage your friends, those who are in positions of influence or positions of power, to really consider and think about how transit is not about, congesting or, your ease of commute, but think about how it's connected to opportunity for everyday folks, and really talk about how transit could be the key to whether or not somebody can get a GED so they can get a job and take care of their kid, or, is it, about whether or not, I'm going to stop at this red light at this time or not. Really think about how it connects to opportunity, and how can we make sure that more Nashvillians are on a pathway to prosperity. How is transit the key to that? And talk to anyone who will listen about that too.
Thank you, Ashley. Those are brilliant. Tagging on, check out the Urban League of Middle Tennessee. They're starting to do a lot of great work around transportation, because their focus is on workforce. And as Ashley has discussed, it's intricately tied to the ability to be mobile. If you don't have transportation, you can't be in the workforce. So check them out. They're doing some great stuff. I think Ashley and I will be part of some stuff with them moving forward in July and August. Also, there's absolutely no reason you could not email your federal congressman, if that's Jim Cooper, and let him know you support retooling funding transit, if that's what you think, or you at least support funding transit because it's important to Nashville and to your community. And even have a meeting with your HOA. Bring it up at your HOA from the top all the way down. So as we wrap it up, Ashley, can you give us a book, a podcast, a website that you often go to for inspiration or motivation for continuing this work?
Well, so I'm going to give you a podcast to look up, and selfishly, I'm going to taste my podcast. And it is called On the Yard. It's on all of the platforms, so look it up, and it's about historically Black colleges and universities. And I'm going to have an episode to talk about transit and HBCUs and that intersection. I cannot wait. So be on the lookout for that. So that's coming up. Also, you can go on YouTube and check out Bob Bernstein and we host a Zoom chat called the City Report Card, where we talk about issues happening in the Nashville region. And we have talked with the lovely Jessica about transit. I encourage all of you to go check that out. And I have this book that I think is super important. It is Making the Unequal Metropolis. And this selfishly is about my other life in education, but this is about how Nashville schools became segregated and desegregated, and busing is a huge part of that. And so we think about schools and what we consider to be good schools or bad schools, and think about where they're located and who has access to them. Transit plays a role, and that is mentioned here in this book. So you guys check this out.
Who's the author of that book?
Ansley T. Erickson, and she signed mine. So I'm very pleased about that. In the struggle.
Thank you.
So
in the struggle.
Metropolis. Yes.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Ashley. It's been a wonderful conversation, as I knew it would. I hope everyone attending got something out of it. This will be posted later on YouTube, so you can view after and share with your friends, post it on your social media, and tell everybody about the importance and the value of transportation and transit, and how it is the bedrock of opportunity.
Yes. Thank you for having me.